That is so fun. Got a little carried away there. Okay. So this is Hey Jude by the Beatles. That ending is a jam. It's so much fun to play. Okay, this is a cool request on a couple of different levels. We're going to talk about two things with this. I'll break down some of the chord progression, but really the fun music theory elements here are secondary dominance and changing of modes. So this song is in the key of F, and the Hey Jude section never deviates from that key. Every chord that's in there is in the key of F major. So we start with an F chord. It gets to its 5, the fifth note of that scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is C. So we go to a C chord. Turns into its dominant 7 portion, which adds a B flat. And we go back to tonic. The second half of this goes to the 4 chord, which is a B flat. Back to tonic. Then to our dominant fifth chord, which is C. And back to F. So in the transition to the next section is the first time we get a secondary dominant chord. A secondary dominant chord is the fifth note or fifth chord of a different chord within the key. So in this case, we take that F major, which is actually our tonic, and we turn it into a dominant 7 by adding an E flat. And typically the function of a secondary dominant is it adds a little bit of flair and flavor to resolve back to the note that it's the dominant of. So F is the dominant chord of B flat, which starts the next part, which is... So the way that worked is we had that B flat that started, and the bass line is doing a walk down, and the way that works, it creates a B flat chord to an inverted D minor, to a G minor, back to our B flat, then it goes to the dominant 7 of F, which is that C7, and then back to F. And that process repeats. At the end of that, after we resolve on F, they do this little na-na part where, and that note that they go to creates a dominant 7 from F, and just straight up from there goes to the next the actual dominant chord of F, which is C. And that takes us back into Hey Jude. Okay, so that's a lesson in secondary dominance. The other part is a change in mode. So the big ending actually separates itself from everything because of the chord progression. So it starts on an F, so that's establishing, hey, we still have an F as tonic. But after that chord, it goes to an E flat major. And that just changes everything, because when we do that, this note, E flat, is not in the key signature of traditional F major. So if we're thinking in modes, traditional F major is known as an Ionian scale. But since I added that extra flat, when you see two flats in a key signature, you think B flat major. But that's only true if B flat is tonic, which means the note that everything goes back to. In this case, it's F, which is the fifth note of that scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if your tonic is that fifth note, this is called a Mixolydian scale. So the end of this goes from being an F Ionian to F Mixolydian. That E flat goes to a B flat, which resolves to F. And there's a little breakdown of Hey Jude by the Beatles. Yes. Okay, now I know that that song gets a lot bigger, but it's actually not possible to play, and I'll explain. Okay, so this is Cornfield Chase by Hans Zimmer from the movie Interstellar. What's really common with a lot of Hans Zimmer's music is that what you hear in the beginning is very likely going to happen the whole time. So the very beginning starts with this. It's this just building progression of an F major 7 to an inverted E minor. Then we have an A minor. Then we have a G6. And that pretty much happens the whole time, except for that one little interlude that you heard me play. And it's this little build that goes back into the chord progression coming back in. And what he ends up doing is he ends up layering multiple arpeggios of those chords that I just mentioned. And it's all beautifully put together in just layers that just keep building and building. And the arpeggios and the broken chords keep getting higher and higher while the orchestra keeps coming in fuller and fuller. And it gives this feeling of flight, which is, I think, why it goes so well with a space movie. But that chord progression just happens the whole time. And it's funny, I kind of suspected this was going to be the case when I was looking up scores, is people are just taking all the notes and putting it on a page. And it's actually impossible to play. Like I was looking at several versions. I'm like, you just have to laugh because you'd have to have 3 or 4 hands to actually make it work. But that doesn't take away from how beautiful the music is and how fitting it is for the movie. But it is kind of the trick that Hans Zimmer very often has, is that simplicity is where the beauty is, and it just keeps it very simple. Where what you're introduced to, there's no reason that we really have to leave it. We can just make it more complicated and more complicated. So just to recap here, we have this climbing melody. And everything goes up to this E. And that's actually pretty important because of what the chord names that I gave you earlier. I said it started on an F major 7. An F major 7 is only an F major 7 when you add an E. So that top note is actually defining that chord. Then, of course, I mentioned we go to an E minor, which, of course, has an E in it. A minor also has this note in it. And then I mentioned a G6. So a G major chord is normally just G, B, D, these notes. The reason it's called a G6 is that we're adding the E that I mentioned earlier, which is a sixth away from our G. So like I mentioned, these chords just happen the whole time, and it just builds and builds into this big thing that eventually just breaks. If you aren't familiar with the piece, I really recommend looking it up. It's really fun. But yeah, that's a little breakdown of Cornfield Chase from Interstellar. This is Dawn from Pride and Prejudice. This is actually from the opening scene, and the theme in this music actually plays throughout the film. This is only intro to the piece, and I chose this because I think this is a really good example of what you call a theme and variation. So all that means is that you have this theme or melodic idea or concept that you introduce in the beginning. And the variation, all that means is that you're taking that idea and changing the way it's performed, or you're changing the time signature. You could be inverting it, whatever. In this song, what ends up happening is the time signature is changed, but it's also being made more complicated. So for instance, if I take just the opening, that melody right after where I just finished earlier comes in a different time signature. But if you just pay attention, you can hear that. very clever. And then even later in another section, it's even made even more complicated. And just big arpeggios that move all around the place. And that actually happens for every little part. You could take this, and that's played like this. Or later. Very, very fun. And then, all that to say, at the very end, it's all repeated. I love how simple that melody is, and yet it's just perfect. It's perfect for the setting and for the film. But yeah, that's a little breakdown of Dawn.